My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. In this video, we want to compare Azure Stack HCI and the HCI capabilities in Windows Server 2022 Data Center. It's very, very important to understand what the differences are and what operating system for your hyperconverged infrastructure to choose depending on your needs. When we have a look at this both stacks, Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI, the first important thing is the naming. Windows Server is still the Windows Server operating system for our traditional server workloads, for all traditional workloads like Active Directory domain services, DNS, file services. We can run Windows applications on it. It runs anywhere. It runs on premises, it runs in Azure, it runs on third-party hypervisors, it runs on Azure Stack HCI. Azure Stack HCI is Microsoft Azure. This is very important to understand. As you learned in the previous modules of this course, Azure Stack HCI is installed on premises on your physical hardware in your data center. But regarding the licensing, regarding the billing, regarding the feature set, it is Microsoft Azure. It's an on-premises OS, which is part of Microsoft Azure. And this means this exciting roadmap we have here with Azure Stack HCI. Because in Azure Stack HCI, we will see a lot of Azure workloads and innovations in the future on premises. It's our virtualization host. It's the host for our hyper-converged infrastructure. We will have a lot of future Hyper-V improvements on Azure Stack HCI. It runs best virtual machines with Windows or Linux operating system, and it runs on your hardware. This is important because when we speak about Azure, usually you will think about the public cloud data centers from Microsoft. And yes, this is also Azure, Microsoft Azure, the public cloud in the regional Microsoft data centers. But Azure Stack HCI is also part of Azure and it runs on your hardware. We already discussed this in a previous module that we need certified hardware, or it's strongly recommended to use certified hardware, the Azure Stack HCI certified systems. But these systems are sold by your well-known hardware vendors, by your well-known OEMs, and these servers run on premises. In both stacks, Azure Stack HCI and Windows Server, important when we talk about Windows Server, we now talk about Windows Server Data Center, we have included the hyper-converged infrastructure. To clarify this, we don't have the HCI features in Windows Server Standard and not in Essentials. But in Windows Server Data Center, we have since Windows Server 2016, that was first introduced, the Storage Spaces Direct functionality. And Storage Spaces Direct is the main component behind the hyper-converged infrastructure stack. And for me, it's very, very important that this is clear to you and that you understand this. I have so often conversations with customers and partners where they tell me they are planning with Azure Stack HCI, and then when we go deeper in the conversation, I realize, okay, they are talking about Azure Stack HCI, but they plan to implement Windows Server 2022 Data Center enabled hyperconverged infrastructure. This is possible. We have Storage Spaces Direct in Windows Server 2022 Data Center. We have it in Windows Server 2019, in Windows Server 2016. We have Hyper-V in both stacks and also the software-defined networking. But there's a huge difference in choosing for Azure Stack HCI and in choosing for Windows Server 2022 Data Center enabled hyperconverged infrastructure. Please never talk about Azure Stack HCI if your physical host OS installation is Windows Server 2022 Data Center based. because Azure Stack HCI provides some unique features regarding the storage spaces direct stack, regarding the Hyper-V virtualization layer, and regarding the possible Azure workloads compared to Windows Server. So only if you use Azure Stack HCI as the host OS on your hyperconverged infrastructure, you will be able to use these additional features. But if you only want to use a hyperconverged infrastructure without this extended functionality, then maybe for your scenario, Windows Server 2022 Datacenter enabled hyperconverged infrastructure is also an option to choose for. But if you choose for this Windows Server-based deployment, then please use the correct wording. It's Windows Server 2022 Datacenter enabled hyperconverged infrastructure. It uses the technology storage spaces direct. It's not Azure Stack HCI. Azure Stack HCI is the correct wording if you really use the Azure Stack HCI deployment on your physical HCI hosts. To complete this picture here, the stack for the hyperconverged infrastructure is managed by Windows Admin Center, and Windows Admin Center can be provided to manage the HCI based on Windows Server and the HCI based on Windows Server 2022 Datacenter. Now the question is, why are there different ways from Microsoft to provide the hyperconverged infrastructure? We already learned in the previous modules that Azure Stack HCI is part of Microsoft Azure, and it's a pay-per-use scenario. We don't have any upfront costs. We don't have to buy an Azure Stack HCI license. We pay on a monthly basis for the cores we use on our Azure Stack HCI hosts. Use is maybe not absolutely correct because we don't pay for the cores that are in use, but we pay for the cores that are enabled from the hardware platform. So all the cores that are seen by the Azure Stack HCI OS have to be, will be charged via the subscription. In Windows Server 2022, we have the situation that we license the physical hosts based on Windows Server Datacenter. We receive the Hyper-V, the unlimited virtual usage rights, the storage spaces direct, the software-defined networking, but we have these upfront costs. We have to license for Datacenter for each host with minimum 16 cores, but all the cores we have in the service. So when we compare these both stacks, they look very, very similar. In both stacks, we have the certified partner hardware. If you have a system that is validated for Azure Stack HCI, usually the partner will also offer this as an HCI-enabled solution based on Windows Server 2022 with storage spaces direct. It's also important to understand that Azure Stack HCI is the name for this operating system. It's not the name for the technology, because the software-defined storage technology, it's storage spaces direct in both stacks. So this is very, very important. And if you are here clear when you communicate to your customers, to your IT colleagues, you will never have the issue that you run into misunderstandings regarding this technology. So please always use the correct wording for these two stacks. Never mix it. The stack on the left-hand side is not Azure Stack HCI in any way. It's Windows Server 2022 enabled hyperconverged infrastructure. The stack on the right-hand side is Azure Stack HCI with the full Azure Stack HCI advantage set. For our virtual machine workloads, we can add Windows Server licenses. We discussed this in the module licensing Azure Stack HCI and workloads. There you have a complete explanation how this works where you have to look for and which different licensing options are there. Software-defined networking is also in both stacks. It's in Windows Server enabled HCI and it's in Azure Stack HCI, and for sure also Hyper-V. Hyper-V is nearly in every Windows version. It's in Windows Server Standard, it's in Essentials, it's in Datacenter, it's in Windows clients. So Hyper-V is the Microsoft hypervisor. When we look at Hyper-V, in Azure Stack HCI, we have some additional features. So if we think about the Hyper-V component itself, then we have here something like an Hyper-V Plus. Hyper-V Plus additional features. In Azure Stack HCI, we have in Hyper-V additional CPU compatibility features. We have additional GPU support for clustered VMs. We have additional Hyper-V support for the nested functionality. This is also there in Windows Server 2022, but it was first introduced in the Azure Stack HCI OS and so on. So we have several exclusive features in Hyper-V that extend the Hyper-V functionality, and it's not provided in Windows Server Hyper-V or in Hyper-V based on Windows Server. And this Hyper-V feature set will be extended in Azure Stack HCI in the next Azure Stack HCI versions. As you know, as you have heard in one of the previous modules, Azure Stack HCI will usually be released in one new version every year, maybe sometimes two new versions. So we have a short release cycle where we will receive these new features and where we will be enabled for these new features. Also in Storage Spaces Direct, we have this plus here in Azure Stack HCI. Storage Spaces Direct is also in Windows Server 2022 Datacenter. The performance and the scalability is comparable. So we have in Windows Server 2022 similar resiliency options. So regarding this HCI stack, we don't have real disadvantages here. But when we have a look at the additional features, so at the plus in Azure Stack HCI, then we have for Storage Spaces Direct in Azure Stack HCI, thin provisioning for volumes. It's not in Storage Spaces Direct in Windows Server. We have the stretched clustering in Storage Spaces Direct in Azure Stack HCI. Stretched clustering is not in Storage Spaces Direct for Windows Server. And so we have also additional features for the Storage Spaces Direct in in Azure Stack HCI operating system. When we look at the virtual usage rights, then we have the situation. Datacenter comes with unlimited virtual Windows Server usage rights on the licensed host. So if you have 2 hosts, you have to license both. If you have 3 hosts, you have to license all the 3 or all the 4 hosts. In Azure Stack HCI, we learned in the licensing module that there are no virtual Windows Server use rights included. So we can add the Windows Server licensing based on the Azure subscription, or we can add the Windows Server licensing via bring your own license in adding Windows Server 2022 Datacenter licenses to enable automatic virtual machine activation for our virtual machines. And when we discuss this, to add Windows Server to Azure Stack HCI to use the bring your own license scenario to enable virtual machine workloads with Windows Server operating system in the VMs on Azure Stack HCI, customers ask often, why should I do this? In Windows Server 2022, Datacenter is already Storage Spaces Direct. There is already Hyper-V. Now I have this twice. And the reason, one of the reasons, is found here in the plus. As I mentioned, extended GPU support, extended CPU support, thin provisioning, stretched clustering. But a huge plus is here in the connectivity to Microsoft Azure. This connectivity to Microsoft Azure provides a huge feature set of Azure features for our Azure Stack HCI stack. So we will be able to take the advantage of Azure workloads and benefits on Azure Stack HCI. These are features like extended security updates for Windows Server, Windows Server Azure Edition, Azure Kubernetes services on Azure Stack HCI, Platform as a Service services, Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI, and we will see more and more of these Azure services that were traditionally provided in the Azure data centers and that are now available on Azure Stack HCI or in the near future on Azure Stack HCI, because you can see this preview marks here. Some of these services are actually in public preview where you already can test them, but where they are not available for production environments. Also, Azure management and governance features are available for Azure Stack HCI or will be available. These are things like monitoring, management via Azure Portal, auto manage for Windows servers on Azure Stack HCI, disaster recovery, PowerShell, and much more. And we will see more and more Azure infrastructure innovations exclusively for Azure Stack HCI. I already mentioned the GPU support for graphical processing units for high available virtual machines. I mentioned the dynamic CPU compatibility, where we have an optimized CPU compatibility if we are using different CPUs in an Azure Stack HCI cluster. We have the secured core server functionality, network ATC for easing the network configuration, thin provisioning, I mentioned this, and kernel soft reboot for optimized patching of the hosts. And these features will be exclusive to Azure Stack HCI. When we look at the list of exclusive features in Azure Stack HCI, it's not a complete list. These are my highlights. This is stretch clustering, thin provisioning, extended security updates for virtual machines with Windows Server and SQL Server, configuration wizard in Windows Admin Center, GPU support for clustered VMs, CPU compatibility mode, support options via Microsoft Azure, so it's very easy and affordable to book support of options via Microsoft Azure for our Azure Stack HCI implementation. Validated hardware nodes and integrated systems with full Azure Stack HCI support. A very, very deep integration to Azure with Azure Arc. The deployment of VMs via the Azure portal. Azure Virtual Desktop for Azure Stack HCI, and much more. If you have any of these services in mind where you see, oh, there's an advantage for me, then you are the perfect Azure Stack HCI customer where you can see, yes, there are additional features when I decide for Azure Stack HCI. And this is only the beginning of this roadmap. So when you look at Azure and which powerful services are available there, I think everybody can imagine what great innovations could be seen there in the next month and next years when we understand that Azure Stack HCI is Microsoft Azure. In the Windows Server 2022 enabled hyperconverged infrastructure, we have the situation that the connectivity to Azure hybrid services is optional. In Azure Stack HCI, it's required. I already mentioned several times in previous modules that it's no problem if we have some disconnectivity between our on-premises Azure Stack HCI servers and Microsoft Azure. The servers have to be registered to Azure because the payment is consumption-based, based on the physical cores in your servers. And the cores have to be uploaded minimum once every 30 days. Usually, an Azure Stack HCI configuration will be connected to Microsoft Azure all the time. But if you have an outage, if you have a disconnectivity on your internet connection, no service will go down. You will not have any interruption of your service on premises. Even if you are disconnected more than 30 days, you will not see any impact on your on-premises services. So when you're running virtual machines, they keep up and running. They are still there. They don't lose any data. They have no downtime. But if you are disconnected for more than 30 days with your Azure Stack HCI cluster, or if you never register it in Azure, you will not be able to create new virtual machines. I think this is absolutely fine because it's a clear statement that the Azure Stack HCI licensing is done on a subscription basis based on the physical cores. In Windows Server enabled HCI, the Azure connectivity is optional. Yes, we can also use things like Azure Arc. The implementation is not the same we have in Azure Stack HCI. We can use Azure Monitor, but we cannot use Azure Virtual Desktop on Windows Server 2022 based HCI. We cannot use the extended security updates there via the Azure functionality. Yes, we can buy extended security updates and pay extra for it. But if you migrate your workload to Azure Stack HCI, the extended security updates are in there. The management tool, the Windows Admin Center, is the same. We use Windows Admin Center to manage the hyperconverged infrastructure provided by Windows Server and also provided by Windows Admin Center. When we have our live demos in the later modules of this course, you will not really see a difference between Azure Stack HCI and Windows Server-based hyperconverged infrastructure when you create virtual machines, when you create volumes, when you manage volumes, when you update your cluster, when you replace disk drives. But we will absolutely focus on Azure Stack HCI in this course because only in Azure Stack HCI we have this plus components in Hyper-V, in Storage Spaces Direct, in Azure Services, and also a big plus, as we have seen on the exclusive feature list, on the hardware platform and the software-defined networking. So it's plus everywhere. In each of these layers here, we have additional features, we have extensions, we have this roadmap with a new version every year, minimum one new version every year. And we have choices of how to license our virtual machines. If you are not familiar with this, I recommend to you to have a look at the module Licensing Azure Stack HCI and Workloads, where I explain this in detail. So hopefully now you understand what's the difference here. And my recommendation is when you are talking to customers, when you are talking to your IT colleagues, always use the correct wording, Windows Server 2022 enabled hyperconverged infrastructure compared to Azure Stack HCI. This course is focused on Azure Stack HCI because only Azure Stack HCI provides this huge list of exclusive features, and only Azure Stack HCI is Azure on premises.